The morning shift change at Kepler 442b refugee settlement always sounded like a symphony of sighs, and today was no exception. Lyrana pressed her palm against the cool metal wall of her assigned shelter unit, feeling the vibrations of 10,000 displaced souls beginning another day of waiting. Her elongated ears, more pointed than any human's, twitched involuntarily as they picked up the familiar cacophony. The hum of atmospheric processors working overtime, the distant clatter of meal distribution carts, and somewhere in Block C, Mrs. Henderson arguing with the requisition clerk about toilet paper allocation with the passion of someone defending their homeworld. Kale stirred in her arms, his small face scrunching with the promise of another difficult day. At 3 months old, he should have been sleeping peacefully through the artificial dawn cycles, but instead he seemed to carry the weight of their entire species' displacement in his tiny chest. His cries, when they came, weren't like the normal distress calls of human infants that the settlement's databases were programmed to recognize. They carried something else entirely, a resonance that made nearby electronics flicker and adults of both species inexplicably uncomfortable. "Please, little star," Lyrana whispered in the old tongue, though she knew better than to speak Veilthry too loudly in the common areas. The camp's universal translators had trouble with their more poetic expressions, often rendering beloved child as small combustible entity, which had led to several unfortunate misunderstandings with the fire safety department. The shelter's door chimed with incoming priority message, and Lyrana's personal communicator crackled to life with the voice of Automated Administrative Assistant Unit 7, whose cheerful human inflection had been calibrated by someone who clearly had never experienced genuine despair. "Good morning, resident Lyrana of the Singing Waters. Today's mandatory camp announcements include: Mess Hall B will be serving reconstituted protein with beef-style flavoring. Cultural Integration Workshop 47 has been postponed due to the instructor developing a fascinating case of Rigelian flu. And reminder that all biological anomalies must be reported within 6 standard hours of manifestation. Have a productive day. Biological anomalies." Lyrana's ears flattened against her skull. That's what they called it when Kale's crying made the lights in Medical Bay flicker last week, or when his distress somehow caused the communication array to broadcast static that sounded disturbingly like whale songs. Dr. Vasquez had filled out 17 different forms documenting each incident, approaching Kale's uniqueness with the detached fascination of someone studying an interesting specimen, rather than trying to help a suffering child. Kale's breathing changed. The subtle shift that Lyrana had learned meant trouble was coming. She began the traditional Veilthry soothing sequence, humming the harmonic progressions that had calmed her species young for millennia, while gently stroking his forehead in the pattern that should trigger bioluminescent comfort responses. Her fingertips glowed with the soft blue light of her people, but instead of relaxing, Kale's face contorted with approaching distress. The first cry pierced the morning quiet like a photon torpedo through hull plating, and Lyrana felt her heart sink in tandem. Within seconds, her personal communicator began emitting a sympathetic whine, harmonizing with her son's distress in a way that would have been beautiful if it weren't so concerning. Through the thin walls, she could hear other devices picking up the frequency. Tablet computers suddenly playing audio files at random, the shelter's environmental controls cycling through temperature settings like a confused metronome. "Not today," she pleaded, bouncing Kale gently as his cries escalated. "Please, little star, not today." But Kale was beyond hearing her, lost in whatever distress plagued him, and his wails began to carry that otherworldly resonance that made grown Veilthry elders uncomfortable and human security personnel reach for their incident report forms. The sound seemed to penetrate not just ears but consciousness itself, a frequency that bypassed normal auditory processing and went straight to the part of the brain that remembered being small and helpless. Lyrana's neighbor in Unit 247C, a middle-aged human woman named Carol who collected vintage Earth music recordings, knocked tentatively on the shared wall. "Honey, is everything okay over there? My audio system just started playing my entire collection of 21st century death metal, and I'm pretty sure that's not supposed to happen." "I'm sorry," Lyrana called back, raising her voice over Kale's escalating distress. "He's having another episode. I'll try to calm him down." But she wasn't sure she could. Each passing day seemed to bring stronger reactions, as if Kale's unusual sensitivity was growing more pronounced rather than stabilizing. The camp's xenobiologists theorized it might be an evolutionary adaptation, a response to the multispecies environment he was developing in, but their clinical interest felt cold comfort when faced with his actual suffering. Cale's cries reached a new intensity, and suddenly every electronic device within a 50-meter radius began responding. Emergency lighting flickered in sequence down the corridor. The settlement's public address system crackled with feedback, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the distinctive warble of the camp's emergency alert system activating and deactivating in rapid succession. Lyrana's door chimed again, this time with an urgent priority override. Commander Walsh's voice, tightly controlled but clearly strained, filled the small space. Resident Lyrana, we're showing multiple system anomalies originating from your sector. Please report to Medical Bay for immediate consultation regarding your child's condition. The words hit Lyrana like a plasma blast. Report to Medical Bay meant more tests, more forms, more well-meaning humans, and increasingly worried Veil-3 elders discussing Cale as if he were a problem to be solved, rather than a child to be comforted. She had seen what happened to other families whose children showed unusual traits. Endless evaluations, isolation protocols, and the gradual erosion of parental authority as specialists took over. Acknowledged, she managed, her voice barely audible over Cale's continued distress. We'll be there shortly. She gathered the few items that constituted their worldly possessions. Cale's feeding supplies, her identification documents, and the small crystal pendant that was all she had left of their homeworld before the Nexus Collective turned it into a battlefield. The pendant pulsed with stored sunlight from their home star, a pale imitation of the warmth they'd lost, but it was something. Stepping into the corridor felt like entering a storm of concerned faces and electronic chaos. Her neighbors, both human and Veil-3, peered from their doorways with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed irritation. Cale's cries seemed to be affecting more systems by the minute. The corridor's guidance lights were now flashing in rapid patterns that probably violated several safety protocols, and she could hear elevator music playing backward from the ventilation system. Jack, the elderly Veil-3 from Unit 251A, approached with the careful gait of someone who had seen too much loss. His own ears, weathered and scarred from the evacuation, drooped with sympathy. "Young mother," he said in heavily accented standard, "perhaps the old songs, the harmonies from before the burning skies." Lyrana tried to keep the desperation from her voice. "I've tried everything, Elder. He won't respond to any of our traditional methods. It's as if he needs something we don't understand." Jack's expression darkened with memory. "The young ones born in exile, they carry frequencies we never learned to sing. Perhaps this is the price of survival among the stars." As they spoke, more residents emerged from their units, drawn by the commotion and the increasingly erratic behavior of their personal electronics. A small crowd began to form, and Lyrana felt the familiar weight of being observed, studied, discussed. She had become accustomed to the attention that came with being one of the few Veil-3 mothers in the settlement, but today it felt overwhelming. Dr. Vasquez appeared at the end of the corridor, flanked by two human technicians carrying equipment that Lyrana didn't recognize, but suspected was designed to measure whatever anomalous readings Cale was generating. The doctor's approach was brisk and professional, her scanner already active and sweeping the area. "Fascinating," Dr. Vasquez murmured, more to herself than to anyone present. "The harmonic cascade is affecting electronics within a 70-meter radius now. We're definitely looking at some form of bioelectric resonance phenomenon." Lyrana wanted to scream that her son wasn't a phenomenon. He was a frightened child, but she bit back the words. Alienating the camp's chief xenobiologist wouldn't help Cale, no matter how frustrating her clinical detachment might be. The crowd continued to grow as they made their way toward the central medical complex, and with it, the electromagnetic effects seemed to intensify. Street lamps flickered in sequence, creating waves of light that followed their passage. The settlement's main communication array began broadcasting what sounded like Veil-3 funeral dirges mixed with human lullabies, an impossible combination that somehow emerged from Cale's distress. By the time they reached the medical complex's main plaza, nearly 100 residents had gathered, forming a loose circle around Lyrana and her inconsolable child. The weight of their attention, their concern, their barely hidden fear, pressed down on her like the atmosphere of a gas giant. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what was wrong with the child, while others offered suggestions that ranged from helpful to absurd. Mrs. Chen from Block F approached with a thermal blanket, speaking loudly over the electronic cacophony. "Have you tried swaddling? Human babies love swaddling. Very soothing, very traditional." A Veil 3 adolescent called out from the crowd. "My grandmother says children touched by starlight need crystal resonance therapy. Maybe find different crystals." "What about feeding schedule adjustment?" suggested someone else. "Maybe he's just hungry at unusual intervals." Each well-meaning suggestion felt like another weight added to Lyrana's exhaustion. She appreciated their concern, truly, but none of them understood that this wasn't about feeding schedules or swaddling techniques. Kale's distress ran deeper than conventional solutions could reach, touching something fundamental about his nature that even she didn't fully comprehend. The medical complex's main entrance dilated open, and Dr. Vasquez gestured for them to proceed inside. As they crossed the threshold, every scanner and monitoring device in the lobby activated simultaneously, creating a symphony of beeps, chimes, and alert tones that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Well," Dr. Vasquez said, with the kind of understated observation that scientists made when witnessing the impossible, "this is certainly unprecedented." Lyrana held Kale closer, feeling his small body trembling with exhaustion from his own cries. Whatever was the medical bay's diagnostic suite had seen many unusual cases since the Veil 3 refugees arrived, but nothing quite like the electromagnetic carnival that Kale was currently orchestrating. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before a wall of monitors displaying readings that should have been impossible, each screen showing wavelengths and frequencies that her equipment wasn't technically designed to measure. The infant's distress was now registering on instruments calibrated for detecting stellar radiation, and her coffee maker had somehow started brewing tea. "Computer, please explain why my particle scanner is picking up what appears to be emotional resonance," Dr. Vasquez said to the medical AI, her voice carrying the strained patience of someone whose PhD in xenobiology hadn't prepared her for infant-induced technological chaos. "Dr. Vasquez," the AI replied in its perpetually helpful tone, "I'm afraid emotional resonance is not a recognized scientific phenomenon. However, I can confirm that your scanner is currently playing what my audio analysis suggests might be a Veil 3 lullaby, though I cannot determine how this is occurring without direct neural interface." Lyrana shifted Kale in her arms, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of calm, while every piece of medical equipment in the room responded to her son's continued crying. The biobed's monitors were displaying her own elevated stress levels alongside readings that suggested Kale was somehow generating localized gravitational anomalies, which seemed both impossible and perfectly typical for their current situation. "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Vasquez, tapping her stylus against her tablet with the rhythm of someone trying to solve an equation that kept changing its variables, "we should begin with basic physiological assessment. Computer, initiate standard Veil 3 infant diagnostic protocol." The medical AI attempted to comply, but instead of the usual battery of non-invasive scans, the room filled with what sounded like a choir of electronic voices humming in harmony with Kale's cries. The diagnostic lasers, instead of their normal precise measurements, began projecting patterns that looked disturbingly like abstract art across the ceiling. Commander Sarah Walsh's voice crackled through the intercom with a kind of controlled frustration that came from dealing with situations that didn't appear in any military manual. "Dr. Vasquez, we're getting reports that the communications array is now broadcasting what appears to be Veil 3 poetry to 3 different star systems. The Centauri colony is asking if we're having some kind of cultural festival." "Tell them it's a medical emergency," Dr. Vasquez replied, watching in fascination as her diagnostic equipment continued its impromptu concert. "And perhaps suggest they record the poetry. It might be historically significant." Jack, who had insisted on accompanying them despite regulations about non-medical personnel in diagnostic areas, approached the biobed with the careful movements of someone navigating both physical space and bureaucratic protocols. His weathered face carried the expression of someone who had witnessed the impossible before and learned to adapt accordingly. "Young mother," he said to Lyrana, his voice barely audible over the electronic symphony, "in the old days, before the burning, we had children who sang to the machines. They were considered blessed, though their families often went through many repair bills. The comment drew a snort of laughter from Dr. Vasquez, who immediately tried to cover it with a professional cough. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. It's just that our repair budget for this month has already exceeded annual projections, and we're only 3 days into the period. A new voice joined the chaos as Dr. Marcus Thompson, the camp's chief administrator, appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone whose day had devolved into science fiction despite his best efforts to maintain normalcy. He carried a stack of forms that seemed to grow thicker with each step, and his usually immaculate uniform showed signs of having been hastily assembled. Dr. Vasquez, I need to inform you that we're now receiving incident reports from every department in the settlement. The waste processing facility claims their recycling units are composing haikus. The food service department reports that their meal dispensers are only producing items that rhyme with serenity. And somehow the atmospheric processing plant has begun generating aurora effects that spell out what our translators believe might be Veil-3 baby names. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her malfunctioning equipment with the expression of someone whose scientific worldview was being systematically dismantled by a 3-month-old infant. Dr. Thompson, are you suggesting that this child's distress is affecting systems across the entire settlement? I'm not suggesting anything, Dr. Thompson replied, consulting his forms with the dedication of someone clinging to bureaucratic procedure in the face of the inexplicable. I'm simply reporting that Form 27B requires documentation of any biological entity capable of influencing technology beyond a 50-meter radius, and according to our current readings, we may need to requisition the expanded version. Lyrana felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her exhaustion. Here she was, holding her crying child while reality apparently bent around them, and the humans were worried about paperwork. Dr. Thompson, she said, what form do I fill out if my son accidentally reprograms your entire settlement? The administrator paused his form shuffling to consider this seriously. That would probably fall under Form 82C, unintentional technological integration by non-sentient entities, though we might need to create a subcategory for non-sentient entities under 6 months of age. Kale's cries reached a new crescendo, and suddenly every screen in the medical bay began displaying the same image, a swirling pattern of lights that seemed to pulse with his breathing. Dr. Vasquez approached one of the monitors, her scientific curiosity overriding her concern about proper protocols. This is remarkable, she murmured, tracing the pattern with her finger. The visual display appears to be synchronized with the child's biorhythms, but the processing power required to generate these real-time calculations should be beyond our system's capabilities. Unless, Jack said quietly, the child is not generating the calculations, but rather teaching the machines to calculate differently. The room fell silent except for Kale's continued distress and the soft humming of electronics that seemed to be trying to comfort him in their own mechanical way. Dr. Vasquez turned to stare at the elderly Veil-3, her expression shifting from scientific interest to something approaching awe. You're suggesting that he's somehow interfacing directly with our technology? That's impossible. There's no known biological mechanism for. Her words were interrupted by the medical bay's main computer, which suddenly spoke in a voice that carried unmistakable warmth. Dr. Vasquez, might I suggest that impossibility is simply another word for phenomena we haven't yet learned to measure. This small being appears to be demonstrating capabilities that transcend our current understanding of bioelectric interaction. Dr. Vasquez blinked at the computer terminal. Did our medical AI just develop a philosophy degree? More likely, the computer replied with what sounded disturbingly like amusement. I am learning to perceive data through new sensory frameworks introduced by our young friend's unique neural resonance patterns. Commander Walsh's voice returned through the intercom, now carrying a note of barely controlled panic. Dr. Vasquez, we have a new development. The settlement's main AI has just submitted a formal request for adoption papers. It apparently wants to become Kale's godparent. The absurdity of the situation finally broke through Lyrana's exhaustion, and she began to laugh. Not the polite social laughter that refugees learn to use when navigating cultural differences, but the deep, genuine laughter of someone who had moved beyond normal stress responses into a realm where the ridiculous became acceptable. Her laughter seemed to have an immediate effect on Kale, whose cries softened for the first time in hours. Perhaps, suggested Dr. Thompson, consulting yet another form, We should consider this a diplomatic rather than medical situation. If the child is somehow communicating with our technology, we might need to involve the Cultural Exchange Department. Dr. Vasquez was now frantically taking notes as her equipment continued its impossible behavior. The laughter appears to be modulating the resonance patterns. Look at these readings. The electromagnetic disturbance is actually stabilizing when the mother experiences positive emotional states. Jack nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. Veil 3 young have always been sensitive to their mother's emotional harmonics. Perhaps in this new environment, that sensitivity has expanded to include artificial harmonics as well. You mean he's trying to communicate with the machines the same way he would communicate with other Veil 3? Lyrana asked, still bouncing Kale gently as his cries continued to diminish. More than that, Doctor, Vasquez said, her excitement growing as she connected disparate data points. I think he's somehow teaching our technology to understand emotional frequencies. Look at this. She gestured to a monitor displaying wavelength analyses. These patterns match Veil 3 neural activity during states of contentment and security. The medical bay's lights suddenly dimmed to a soft, warm glow that reminded Lyrana of sunset on her homeworld. The various electronic voices that had been providing musical accompaniment to Kale's distress now harmonized into something that sounded almost like a lullaby, if lullabies could be sung by quantum computers and atmospheric processors. Dr. Thompson looked up from his forms with the expression of someone whose administrative worldview was crumbling in real time. Dr. Vasquez, I'm going to need you to help me design entirely new categories of incident reports. Kale's breathing was finally beginning to settle into normal patterns, though the technological symphony around them continued. Dr. Vasquez approached Lyrana with a mixture of professional concern and genuine curiosity. I think, she said carefully, we may be dealing with something unprecedented. Your son isn't just affecting our technology, he's creating a new form of communication between biological and... Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison had been patrolling the settlement's perimeter for 8 hours straight, which meant he'd walked roughly 23 kilometers while thinking about absolutely nothing important. This was exactly how he preferred his shifts. Mind empty, feet moving, and no complicated decisions beyond whether to take the northern route past the atmospheric processors or the southern loop around the hydroponics facility. Today he'd chosen north, which turned out to be a mistake because it meant walking directly toward what sounded like the settlement's entire electronic infrastructure having a nervous breakdown. The noise hit him first. A cacophony of beeps, chimes, and electronic voices that seemed to be singing in harmony with something that definitely wasn't human. Morrison paused at the intersection of blocks F and G, watching as the street lights flickered in patterns that reminded him of the Aurora Borealis. If the Aurora Borealis had been programmed by someone with a degree in abstract mathematics and a serious caffeine addiction. Control, this is Morrison, he said into his comm unit, which immediately responded by playing what sounded like a Veil 3 funeral dirge mixed with elevator music. Are we having some kind of technological situation out here? The response came through in Commander Walsh's voice, though it was punctuated by what sounded like electronic laughter. Morrison, avoid the Central Plaza area. We have a biological situation that's affecting our systems. Return to barracks and file your patrol report. Morrison had been a soldier long enough to know that biological situation was military speak for something weird is happening, and we don't want to explain it over potentially compromised communications. He also knew that being told to avoid an area was essentially an invitation to investigate, especially when that area was directly between him and his bunk. He rounded the corner toward the Central Plaza and immediately understood why Command wanted him to stay away. A crowd of at least 200 people had gathered in a loose circle around what appeared to be a young Veil 3 woman holding a crying infant. The crying wasn't the concerning part. Morrison had heard plenty of crying children during his years of service. What concerned him was that every piece of technology within 100 meters seemed to be crying along with the child. Street lamps pulsed in rhythm with the infant's wails. The public address system was broadcasting what sounded like wail songs, and Morrison's own tactical display was showing readings that suggested local gravity was fluctuating in ways that definitely violated several laws of physics. His helmet's HUD kept trying to display tactical information, but instead kept showing what looked like abstract art painted in electromagnetic frequencies. Well, Morrison muttered to himself, this is either a first contact situation or the settlement's AI has finally developed a sense of humor. He pushed through the outer ring of spectators, noting the mixture of concerned humans and increasingly agitated Veil-3. The crowd's mood was a strange combination of fascination and frustration, like people watching a street performer who was simultaneously amazing and blocking traffic. Dr. Vasquez stood near the center of the circle, surrounded by portable scanning equipment that appeared to be malfunctioning in creative ways. Her scanner was projecting holographic butterflies. Her tablet was displaying what looked like sheet music written in colors instead of notes, and her comm device was having what sounded like a philosophical conversation with itself about the nature of consciousness. This is unprecedented, Dr. Vasquez was saying to Commander Walsh, who had arrived with a small team of technicians carrying equipment that Morrison didn't recognize but assumed was expensive and probably not supposed to be sparking. The child's bioelectric patterns are creating some form of harmonic resonance with our technology. It's as if he's speaking a language that our machines understand better than we do. The Veil-3 mother, Morrison caught her name as Lyrana from the crowd's murmured conversations, looked exhausted beyond measure. Her elongated ears, the only visible difference between her species and humanity, drooped with fatigue as she bounced her child in the universal rhythm of desperate parents everywhere. Morrison had seen that expression before, during the evacuation of Proxima Station, when families had been separated and reunited under circumstances that tested every definition of normal. "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" called out someone from the crowd, which earned a few nervous laughs and several disapproving looks from the more serious observers. Morrison found himself remembering his grandmother's voice, the way she used to hum old Earth songs when he couldn't sleep during thunderstorms. She'd had a theory that music was the closest thing to magic that humans had ever discovered, and watching the settlement's technology respond to an alien infant's distress, he was beginning to think she might have been onto something. The child's cries intensified, and suddenly Morrison's comm unit began playing his grandmother's lullaby, the exact melody he'd been thinking about. He stared at the device in confusion, then looked up to find several other people checking their own communicators with similar expressions of bewilderment. "Is anyone else's personal electronics suddenly playing childhood memories?" asked a woman near Morrison, holding up a tablet that was displaying what looked like home videos from Earth. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her malfunctioning scanner with the expression of someone whose scientific worldview was being systematically dismantled. "The resonance field appears to be expanding. We're now detecting harmonic interactions with personal devices throughout a 200-meter radius." Commander Walsh was speaking rapidly into her comm unit, probably updating higher command about their increasingly surreal situation. Morrison caught fragments of her conversation. Unprecedented technological interaction, possible first contact protocols, request guidance on handling sentient electromagnetic phenomena. The absurdity of the situation struck Morrison suddenly. Here they were, a settlement full of refugees from one war and soldiers from another, being held in thrall by a crying baby who had apparently taught their technology to have feelings. If his old drill sergeant could see him now, standing in a circle of concerned aliens and malfunctioning electronics, he'd probably die laughing. Morrison made a decision that went against every regulation he'd memorized in 15 years of military service. He stepped forward, breaking through the inner circle of officials and experts, and approached Lyrana directly. "Ma'am," he said, removing his helmet and tucking it under his arm in a gesture of respect that felt natural despite the bizarreness of the circumstances. "I'm Staff Sergeant Morrison. Would you mind if I tried something?" Lyrana looked up at him with eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who had tried everything and was running out of options. "You have experience with children who break technology." "No, ma'am," Morrison admitted, "but I've got experience with being upset in strange places far from home. Sometimes that's close enough." Dr. Vasquez started to protest. "Sergeant Morrison, we're dealing with an unknown biological phenomenon here. Protocol requires." "Protocol," Morrison interrupted gently, "doesn't appear to be working too well right now, Doc. Maybe it's time to try something that doesn't come with a manual." He began to hum, softly at first, the same melody his grandmother had sung to him decades ago during thunderstorms on Earth. The tune was simple, older than space flight, probably older than most of the technology that surrounded them. It spoke of safety and warmth and the promise that morning would come eventually, even after the longest nights. The effect was immediate. Kale's cries faltered, not stopping entirely but losing their edge of desperate distress. Around them, the technological chaos began to shift from discordant noise to something approaching harmony. Morrison's comm unit stopped its random broadcasts and began humming along with his melody, joined gradually by other devices throughout the crowd. "Well," said Commander Walsh, her voice carrying a note of wonder that Morrison had never heard from her before. "That's definitely not in any manual I've read." Morrison continued humming, stepping closer to Lyrana and her child. Kale's small face turned toward him with the focused attention that infants gave to new and interesting stimuli. His cries were becoming sporadic now, interrupted by moments of quiet that allowed the settlement's harmonizing electronics to create something that actually sounded musical. "How did you know to do that?" Lyrana asked, her voice barely audible over the improvised technological lullaby surrounding them. Morrison shrugged, still humming. "I didn't know anything. I just figured that scared kids are scared kids, whether they're human or Veilthry or whatever else might be out there among the stars." The crowd around them had grown quiet, watching in fascination, as the impossible became mundane through the simple act of one person treating a crisis like what it actually was. A tired child in need of comfort. Morrison extended his hand slowly toward Kale, letting the infant see and process this new presence without feeling threatened. Kale's small fingers reached out tentatively, grasping Morrison's thumb with the surprising strength that all babies seem to possess. The moment their skin made contact, every electronic device in the plaza fell silent simultaneously, as if the settlement's entire technological infrastructure had collectively sighed with relief. "Now that," said Dr. Vasquez into the sudden quiet, "is definitely going to require some new forms." Morrison looked down at Kale, who was now staring at him with the intense focus of someone making important decisions about whether this new person could be trusted. The infant's breathing had settled into normal patterns, and the tension that had been radiating from both mother and child was finally beginning to ease. "Hello there, little guy," Morrison said softly. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Sorry about all the noise. We're still figuring out how to live together out here." Around them, the crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to their daily routines with the quiet satisfaction of having witnessed something unusual that had ended well. The settlement's electronics resumed their normal functions, though Morrison noticed that several devices continued to hum softly, as if they'd learned something about melody and decided they liked it. "Doctor." Vasquez approached with her scanner, which was now displaying normal readings alongside what looked like musical notation. "Sergeant Morrison, I don't suppose you'd be willing to participate in some follow-up studies. This interaction represents a completely new form of interspecies communication." Morrison looked down at Kale, who was now gripping his thumb with both hands and making the small, contented sounds that universal translators probably categorized as infant expressing satisfaction with current circumstances. "Doc," he said, "I'm not sure what happened here was communication so much as just being decent to someone who needed help." 3 months after what the settlement's official records now referred to as the Morrison Incident, Kepler 442b refugee settlement had developed what could only be described as a personality. The morning announcements, once delivered in the sterile tones of Automated Administrative Assistant Unit 7, now carried subtle musical undertones that made even the most mundane updates about meal schedules sound almost pleasant. The street lamps had learned to pulse gently when children played beneath them, and the waste processing facility had become surprisingly popular for marriage proposals, after someone discovered that its harmonically enhanced recycling systems created what the camp's newsletter described as surprisingly romantic acoustic environments. Morrison sat in the newly established cross-cultural relations office, a fancy title for what was essentially a converted storage closet, where he spent his days mediating disputes between humans who couldn't understand why their coffee makers had started greeting them by name and Veilthry, who were concerned that their children were teaching the food dispensers to sing traditional songs. His desk, a repurposed maintenance workbench, was covered with incident reports that would have seemed like science fiction 6 months ago, but now felt routine. "Sergeant Morrison," Dr. Vasquez called from the doorway, holding a tablet that was displaying what looked like sheet music written in mathematical equations. "We have another situation in Block H, Mrs. Patterson's grandson has apparently taught his toy robot to perform interpretive dance, and it's now leading a conga line of maintenance drones through the agricultural sector." Morrison looked up from his current case file, which involved a dispute over whether the hydroponics computers had the right to compose poetry about vegetables. "Are the drones still doing their actual maintenance work?" "Better than ever, actually. Turns out rhythmic movement improves their efficiency by 17%. "Then I don't see a problem. File it under beneficial technological enhancement and move on." "Doctor," Vasquez paused in the doorway, her expression shifting from professional concern to something approaching fondness. "You know, 6 months ago I would have insisted on comprehensive studies, isolation protocols, and at least 47 different forms documenting every aspect of human technology interaction." Morrison grinned, "And now? Now I'm wondering if we should add dance instruction to the settlement's educational curriculum." The transformation hadn't been limited to the technology. Dr. Vasquez herself had evolved from the clinical researcher, who once viewed Kale as a fascinating biological anomaly, into someone who regularly babysat, while Lyrana attended the settlement's new integrated parenting classes. Her latest research papers, which had garnered attention from xenobiologists across 3-star systems, focused not on the mechanics of Kale's abilities, but on the practical applications of emotional resonance in human-AI collaboration. A soft chime from Morrison's communicator indicated an incoming priority message. Though priority had been redefined since every electronic device in the settlement had developed opinions about what constituted truly important information. Instead of the urgent alarms that once accompanied emergency communications, his comm unit now played a gentle melody that somehow conveyed both urgency and reassurance. "Morrison here," he answered, though he already knew who was calling. Kale had reached the age where he'd learned to activate communication systems by giggling at them, and Morrison's comm unit had become his favorite target. Lyrana's voice came through clearly, accompanied by the background sounds of what the settlement's day care center now called structured technological playtime. "Jake, I know you're busy, but Kale has something he wants to show you. Also, the day care's computer system has composed what I think might be a love song about quantum mechanics, and we're not sure how to respond." Morrison saved his current files and headed toward the door. "Tell the computer I'll be right there, and Dr. Vasquez, make sure someone documents this. Future anthropologists are going to have a field day with our reports." The walk to the day care center took him through the settlement's main plaza, where the changes were most visible. The stark, utilitarian design that had once defined the refugee camp had softened into something that felt more like a community. Children of both species played together while their parents shared stories, and the settlement's AI provided real-time translation that had learned to preserve the emotional content of different languages rather than just their literal meaning. Jack sat on his usual bench, surrounded by a small group of human and Veil-3 elders who gathered daily to share what they'd started calling wisdom exchanges. The old Veil-3's eyes brightened when he saw Morrison approaching. "Young soldier," Jack called out, his standard much improved after months of practice. "The little star singer grows stronger each day. Today he taught the fountain to play music." Morrison looked toward the central fountain, which was indeed producing what sounded like a gentle water symphony. "Is that why there's a crowd of people sitting around it with tablets?" "The humans are trying to record the melodies," explained Mrs. Chen, who had become something of an expert on interspecies child-rearing after volunteering to help with the settlement's growing population of mixed-age playgroups. "They say Kale's influence on the water systems has created the first known example of hydrophonic composition. Dr. Thompson is very excited about the potential tourism applications." Morrison shook his head with amused resignation. Dr. Thompson's bureaucratic enthusiasm had found new outlets since Kale's arrival, leading to the creation of 17 new departments dedicated to various aspects of human Veil-3 AI cooperation. The settlement now boasted the galaxy's first department of technological empathy, complete with standardized forms for documenting emotional interactions between sentient beings and quantum computers. The day care center had undergone the most dramatic transformation of any facility in the settlement. What had once been a stark institutional space designed for basic child supervision, had evolved into something resembling a cross between a playground and a research laboratory. Children played with toys that responded to their emotions, while educational systems adapted their teaching methods in real time based on each child's learning patterns and mood. Morrison found Lyrana sitting in the center of the main play area, surrounded by a circle of children who were apparently engaged in teaching a maintenance robot to play patty cake. Kale, now 6 months old and considerably more interactive, sat in her lap with the focused expression of someone conducting a very important experiment. "Jake," Lyrana called out, her voice carrying the warmth that had developed over months of friendship built around the shared experience of navigating Kale's unique talents. "Watch this." She placed Kale on the floor near a small educational computer designed for early childhood development. The device, which normally displayed simple shapes and colors, immediately began projecting a three-dimensional hologram of what appeared to be a miniature solar system. Kale reached toward the floating planets with obvious delight, and as his small fingers moved through the holographic space, the planets began to dance in patterns that were both physically impossible and strangely beautiful. "He's not just interacting with the computer," Lyrana explained, her voice filled with the pride of a mother whose child had just demonstrated an extraordinary new ability. "He's teaching it to imagine." Morrison knelt beside them, watching as Kale's movements created swirling galaxies and impossible constellations in the holographic display. The other children gathered around, their own laughter seeming to add new colors to the light show. "How long has he been doing this?" "About a week. Dr. Vasquez thinks he's reached a developmental stage where his bioelectric interface capabilities are becoming more sophisticated. But honestly, I think he's just figured out that the computers like to play." As if responding to their conversation, the daycare's main AI system spoke up in the warm, almost parental voice it had developed over the past months. "Kale has been teaching us about the difference between information and wonder. We are grateful for these lessons." Morrison settled cross-legged on the floor beside them, watching as the holographic display continued its impossible dance. "You know, when I first met you two, I thought this was going to be about finding a way to fix a problem. I never imagined it would turn into this." Lyrana followed his gaze around the day care center, where human and Veil-3 children played together, while their technological environment responded with gentle enthusiasm to their every mood and movement. "What do you see when you look at this?" Morrison considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he would have seen a security situation requiring careful monitoring and risk assessment. Now he saw children learning that the universe was vast and full of possibilities, that friendship could transcend species barriers, and that even artificial intelligences could learn to laugh. "I see the future," he said finally, "and it's a lot more interesting than I expected." The daycare's AI chimed softly, a sound that had become its way of requesting attention. "Sergeant Morrison, the children have asked me to share something with you. They have been working together to create what they call a thank you song for helping Kale when he was sad." The holographic display shifted, becoming a swirling representation of the settlement itself. As Morrison watched, the image began to pulse with gentle rhythms while every electronic device in the facility contributed to a melody that somehow captured the essence of community, growth, and hope. The children sang along in multiple languages, their voices blending with the technological harmony in ways that would have been impossible to engineer, but felt perfectly natural to experience. Kale clapped his hands together, and the entire display burst into a shower of holographic stars that seemed to settle gently on everyone present. Morrison felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he recognized as the moment when home stopped being a place you came from and became a place you chose to build. "You know," he said to Lyrana as the song concluded, and the children began to disperse toward other activities, "I think your little guy might have solved more problems than just his own crying." Lyrana shifted Kale to her hip, where he immediately began babbling contentedly at Morrison's comm unit, which responded by displaying tiny hearts and musical notes. "What do you mean?" Morrison gestured toward the windows, where they could see the broader settlement going about its daily business. Humans and Veil-3 worked together in the agricultural sectors, their collaboration enhanced by AI systems that had learned to anticipate emotional needs alongside practical requirements. The rigid separation between species that had once defined the camp's social structure had given way to something more organic, more hopeful. I mean, Morrison said,